There is a moment, right before you tuck a new clematis into the ground, that quietly decides the next 5 years of that plant. It lasts about 30 seconds, and almost every instruction you have ever been handed goes silent at exactly that moment. Most folks believe a clematis lives or dies by how you care for it afterward. The watering, the feeding, the pruning, you're half afraid to get wrong. But the truth, the old county extension men understood, the ones who could tell what ailed a plant by kneeling down and looking hard at the dirt, is that a clematis is mostly decided before you ever stand back up. It's decided by what you chose at the garden center, where you set it, which way you faced it, and how deep you were brave enough to bury it. Get those right, and clematis is one of the easiest, most generous plants you will ever grow. Get them wrong, and you'll spend 3 summers blaming yourself, or worse, blaming the plant, for something that was settled in that first half minute with a trowel in your hand. So today we're walking through 10 of those mistakes, not care mistakes, setup mistakes, the ones baked in on planting day. Everyone is common. Everyone is fixable, even if your plant is already in the ground. And a few of them go against everything your gardening instinct is screaming at you to do. Stay with me to the last one, because it's the mistake that makes good people dig up a perfectly healthy clematis and toss it on the compost heap, a full year before it was ever going to show them what it could do. And if you've lost a clematis before, if you've stood there staring at a bare, sulking stick, wondering what you did to deserve it, I want you to hear this clearly. It almost certainly was not your green thumb. It was the setup. Nobody at the garden center walks you out to the parking lot and explains the 30 seconds. They sell you the plant. They sell you the trellis, and the little bag of feed, and maybe a steak. But the judgment, the part that's actually free, that never made it onto a shelf. Because you can't put a barcode on knowing where to dig the hole. Here's the one thread I want you to hold through this whole video. You are not really planting a vine, you are planting a root system into living soil. The flowers are just the part that shows. Nearly every mistake we're about to cover is really a soil mistake wearing a pretty disguise. Too dry, too hot, too shallow, too soon. Feed the soil, settle the roots right, and the vine takes care of the rest. That's the whole secret. And it's the one thing no catalog ever tried to sell you. One small thing before we dig in. If you gardened back when every county had an extension office you could just call, and a real person would tell you the truth for free, do me a kindness and drop the state you're gardening in down in the comments. I love seeing where this old, honest kind of gardening still lives. Then let's get our hands dirty. Mistake number 1 happens before you've even left the store. You buy the photograph instead of the plant. We've all done it. You're standing in front of a rack of clematis, and one tag has a bloom on it the size of a saucer, deep velvet purple, and something in you just says, that one. You never turn the tag over. You never ask the 2 questions that actually decide whether this plant becomes a joy or a heartbreak. How big does this thing get? And which pruning group is it in? Take size first. There's a clematis called Montana that will bury a photograph in flowers, and will also grow 20 feet wide and swallow a small fence, a shed, and a good part of your neighbor's yard if you let it. People plant that vigorous giant against a dainty little obelisk, and then wrestle it for years. Someone else buys a compact one, sets it on a pergola built for a monster, and waits forever for it to cover anything at all. Now the pruning group. This is the one that trips up even lifelong gardeners. The horticulture folks at Kansas State University's Extension Service got so worn out watching people's eyes glaze over at the complicated group charts that they finally boiled the whole thing down to a single line. The later in the year your clematis flowers, the harder you cut it back. Flowers in spring, barely touch it. Flowers in high summer, you can cut it near to the ground. That's it. That's the part you actually need. Why does any of this matter on planting day? Because if you don't know your group, you will eventually take the shears to it at the wrong time and lop off every flower bud the plant was saving for you. Here's how you settle it before you ever get home. Turn the tag over. If it flowers in early spring, that's group 1, and your job is mostly to leave it alone. A big early summer bloom, that's group 2, a light trim. Late summer or fall, group 3, and you can be bold with the shears. And if the tag is long gone, say you inherited the plant with the house, don't fret. Watch it for 1 season and note when it blooms. The plant will tell you its group, if you let it. Mistake number 2 is choosing a delicate clematis when a nearly indestructible one was sitting right beside it for the very same price. Here's something the tag almost never tells you. Some clematis are far tougher than others. The big, blowsy dinner plate hybrids, the ones that seduce you from across the store, are also the ones most likely to be struck down by that dramatic collapse gardeners call clematis wilt, where a healthy vine goes limp and blackens almost overnight. It hits the fancy large-flowered types hardest. But there's a whole family of clematis that barely ever gets it. They're called the Viticellas. Smaller flowers, yes, but masses and masses of them, tough as old boots, and just about immune to wilt. Names to look for on the tag: Étoile Violette, Polish Spirit, Madame Julia Korovon. Growers who've fought wilt for years will tell you the simplest cure was never a spray or a tonic in a bottle. It was switching to a Viticella and never thinking about the problem again. Now, I'm not telling you to swear off the big fancy hybrids forever. If your heart is set on a saucer-sized bloom, grow it and love it. But if this is your first clematis, or you've lost one before, or you just want a plant that thrives on a little honest neglect, start with a Viticella. Give it good living soil, keep its roots cool, and it will forgive you nearly everything. There's a quiet dignity in choosing the tough, reliable plant over the flashy one. Our grandparents gardened that way out of necessity. Turns out it's also just good sense. Mistake number 3 is one almost nobody warns you about, and it's the kind that can quietly do harm long after you've forgotten you planted it. You bring home a clematis that doesn't belong in this country at all. There's a clematis sold all over America under the sweet-sounding name Sweet Autumn Clematis. In late summer, it foams over everything in a blanket of tiny white, honey-scented flowers, and it is genuinely lovely. It is also, across much of the country, an invasive weed. The botanical name to watch for is Clematis terniflora. It came here from Asia as an ornamental, slipped over the garden fence, and is now listed as invasive in at least 10 states. You'll see it smothering roadsides, fence lines, and the edges of woodlands, seeding itself everywhere the wind carries it, crowding out the native plants our songbirds and pollinators actually depend on. The extension services at Clemson and the University of Florida and the Missouri Invasive Plant Council all flag it plainly. Now here's the part that feels like a small mercy. There is a Native American clematis that looks almost exactly like it. It's called Virgin's Bower, Clematis virginiana, and it gives you the very same froth of late summer white, but it belongs here. It feeds native bees and butterflies, and it will never run riot through the countryside. So how do you tell them apart at the garden center, when they're often sold under nearly the same name? You look at the leaf edges. This is exactly the kind of quiet, specific knowledge the old plantsmen carried in their heads. The invasive one, terniflora, has smooth leaf margins. The native one, virginiana, has jagged, toothed edges. Smooth means leave it on the shelf. Toothed means bring it home. One glance at a leaf, and you've made a choice your whole neighborhood benefits from, the birds included. You will almost never hear that at the register. Mistake number 4 is a sneaky one, because the spot looks perfect. You've got a nice wall, or a solid fence. You picture the clematis climbing all over it. So you dig your hole right up against the base, snug against the bricks, and tuck the plant in tight. And then it struggles, and you cannot for the life of you work out why. Here's what's happening, and it has a name most gardeners have never heard: the rain shadow. That narrow strip of ground pressed right up against a wall or a solid fence is very nearly the driest place in your whole garden. The structure blocks the rain from ever reaching it. Worse, brick and stone and concrete footings are thirsty things. They pull moisture out of the soil around them. So you've taken a plant that wants a cool, steadily moist root, run more than almost anything, and set it down in the one spot guaranteed to stay bone dry no matter how the heavens open. And remember what I told you at the start. This isn't really a wall problem. It's a soil moisture problem. You've planted living roots into dead, dusty ground. The fix costs you nothing but a few inches of judgment. Dig your hole at least 12 to 18 inches out from the base of the wall, out where the rain actually lands, in soil that's alive and holds water. If there's a roof or a gutter hanging over above, come out further still. The Royal Horticultural Society has been telling gardeners this for decades, and it's every bit as true in Ohio as it is in England. Your clematis can still climb that wall. It just needs to eat and drink out in the good ground first. And how it travels from that hole back to the wall, well, that's mistake number 5. And most people get it exactly backwards. Mistake number 5 follows right on the heels of the last one. You've done the smart thing and planted your clematis out in the moist, living soil, a foot or more from the wall. Now, which way does it lean? Most people plant it bolt upright, like a little soldier, and then wonder why it flops around with nowhere to go. The fix is simple, and it feels almost too easy. Lay the plant at a gentle slant and aim the whole thing back toward the support you want it to climb. Angle the root ball. Tilt the stems. Give it a cane or a length of twine to run up along that lean. You're drawing it a map. The roots stay happy out in the good soil, and the top travels back to exactly where you wanted the show. And while we're here, one quick word about what you ask it to climb, because I made this mistake for years myself. A clematis does not climb like ivy. It has no sticky pads. It climbs by wrapping its leaf stalks, the little stems that hold each leaf, around anything thin enough to grab. And I do mean thin. About the width of a pencil, no more. Give it a fat pergola post or a broad fence rail, and those leaf stalks reach out, find nothing they can curl around, and the whole plant slides off in a heap. So before it ever needs it, run some wire, or netting, or a thin trellis over that support. Give those little fingers something pencil slim to hold. We went deep on the climbing habit in another video, so I'll keep it short here. Just know the support has to be thin, and it has to be ready before the plant ever arrives. Mistake number 6 is my favorite, because fixing it turns a struggling clematis into a picture, and it's a piece of old cottage garden wisdom that's been quietly forgotten. You made your clematis climb all alone. Picture the way we're usually told to do it. One clematis, one bare trellis, flat against a wall, out on its own in the wind and the sun. Now here's how the old gardeners did it, and how one of the finest clematis breeders who ever lived, an Englishman named Raymond Evison, who has won gold at the Chelsea Flower Show more times than most of us have grown a decent tomato, still insists it should be done. Never grow a clematis alone up a bare wall. Grow it through something living, a climbing rose, a sturdy shrub, another, earlier climber. Why? Think about where clematis grows in the wild. It scrambles up through other plants, in a shared little microclimate, its roots shaded by its neighbors, and its face reaching for the light. When you grow a clematis through a rose or a shrub, you are recreating exactly that. The host plant shades and cools those precious roots for free. No stone slab, no fuss. It hands the clematis a natural, pencil-thin framework to climb. And you get 2 shows on one patch of ground. The rose blooms, and then the clematis threads its flowers through the very same branches weeks later, when the rose has gone quiet. A purple clematis, lacing through a climbing rose, is one of the most beautiful things you can grow. And it costs you nothing but the willingness to stop planting everything in its own lonely little box. That's the setup, most of it decided on planting day. Which plant, where it goes, which way it faces, and who it gets to lean on. Now, before we get our hands properly dirty with the deep how-to, the part where we finally put this thing in the ground, let me hand you something to keep. Everything we're covering today, the 10 mistakes, the pruning group shortcut, the tough varieties worth choosing, and an honest year-by-year of what to actually expect. I've gathered it all onto a single page you can print and tape inside the shed door, or tuck into your garden journal. There's a code on the screen right now. Point your phone's camera at it, and the page is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for, nothing to buy. Then stay right here, because the next mistake is the one that feels the most right and does the most quiet damage, and nearly every gardener makes it. Mistake number 7 is the big one, and it's dangerous precisely because it feels correct. You planted your clematis at the same depth it sat in the pot, exactly the way you plant everything else. And normally, that instinct is right. Match the soil line. Don't bury the stem. That rule keeps your roses happy, and keeps most everything happy. But clematis is the rare exception that breaks it. With most clematis, you want to plant it deeper, sinking the crown 2 to 3 inches below the surface, so the base of the stem and a node or two end up underground. I won't linger here, because we gave deep planting a whole segment of its own in another video, but the short of it is this, and the Illinois extension puts it plainly. Burying those lower nodes does two beautiful things. First, it gives you insurance. If that dramatic wilt ever strikes, or a slug chews clean through a stem, the buried buds below ground can push up brand new shoots and carry on, where a shallow planted clematis has nothing in reserve and simply dies. Second, every buried node becomes a fresh growing point, so you get a fuller, bushier plant with many stems instead of one lonely whip. One honest caution, because the internet loves to tell you to bury every clematis deep, and that isn't quite true. The evergreen kinds, the ones like Armandii that hold their leaves all winter, do not want their crowns buried, and planting them deep can rot them. So the big deciduous hybrids and the vigorous ones plant deep. The evergreens plant right at soil level. When in doubt, for the common large-flowered kinds most of us are growing, deep is the safer bet. And if your clematis is already in the ground at pot level, don't tear it out. Next time you top up the bed, just mound a few inches of good compost over the base. You can mend this one after the fact, and the plant will thank you for it. Mistake number 8 is about timing and handling, the two things we rush when we're excited to get a new plant in the ground. First, the moment. The worst time to plant a clematis is the one most of us are tempted by, the blazing middle of summer, when it's in full flower at the garden center and looks irresistible. Set that plant into hot, dry July soil, and it spends all its strength just trying not to die instead of settling in. The kinder windows are spring, once the hard frosts have passed, or early fall, 6 to 8 weeks before your first hard freeze. Fall is a quiet secret in the milder parts of the country. The top of the plant slows down, but the roots keep working in the still warm soil, so it wakes in spring already anchored and ready to run. Second, the handling, the part everyone skips. When you slide that plant out of its pot, two things are usually true, and both of them matter. The root ball is often bone dry right in the center, because water runs down the sides of a pot and misses the middle, and the roots are frequently coiled around and around into a tight, root-bound knot. So before it ever goes near the hole, stand the whole pot in a bucket of water and let it drink until the bubbles stop. 5 minutes, maybe 10. Then gently tease a few of those circling roots loose with your fingers, so they'll reach out into the new soil instead of strangling themselves in the old shape of the pot. It takes 2 minutes. It is the difference between roots that spread into your living soil and roots that sit in a dry little fist and sulk. Feed the soil, yes, but first, make sure the roots can actually find it. Mistake number 9 is the one born of good intentions. You planted everything right, and then you walked away and let the plant fend for itself through its first summer. And a clematis, in its first year or two, cannot yet fend for itself. Here's the truth the garden centers won't dwell on. A clematis is a thirsty plant, and in its first couple of seasons, water matters more than feed, more than fancy tonics, more than anything in a bag. The single most common reason a young clematis struggles is simply that it dried out while nobody was watching. So through that first year especially, water it deeply and regularly. Not a daily splash on the leaves, a good, slow soak at the roots, enough to wet the soil well down, every week or so, and more in a heat wave. You're teaching those roots to go deep and settle in. Once it's established, 2 or 3 years on, a clematis is remarkably self-sufficient. But it has to be carried across that first stretch, the way you'd carry any young thing. And there's one small heartbreak to watch for in that first tender spring. Slugs and snails absolutely love the soft new shoots of a young clematis as they push up from the ground. They'll come out on a mild, damp evening and mow those first shoots right off, and a new gardener stares at the little stumps and assumes the plant has died. It hasn't. It got eaten, a ring of something sharp and gritty around the base. Coarse grit, crushed eggshell, whatever you've got on hand, makes the crawl unpleasant enough that they go looking elsewhere. And take heart. As those stems grow up and turn woody, the slugs lose all interest. It's only that first vulnerable flush you have to stand guard over. This is exactly the sort of thing the old-timers knew to check for on an April evening, flashlight in hand. And that brings us to mistake number 10, the one I saved for last, because it breaks the most hearts and empties the most flower beds. You expected a miracle in the first year, And when the miracle didn't come, you gave up on a plant that was only just getting started. There's an old gardener's rhyme about perennials and vines, and it's worth more than most of the advice you'll ever pay for. It goes, the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. That is exactly how a clematis works. In year one, above the ground, it can look like almost nothing is happening. A few modest stems, a handful of flowers if you're lucky. But under the soil, out of sight, it is doing the most important work of its whole life. It is building roots. It is settling into your living soil, laying the foundation for everything that comes after. The gardener who understands that waters faithfully, keeps the faith, and is repaid in year 3 with a wall of flowers. The gardener who expected a miracle digs the poor thing up in September, convinced it's a dud, and throws away a plant that was one summer from glory. And here is the counterintuitive kindness that helps it leap sooner. And I know it's going to feel wrong. In that first spring after planting, when your new clematis has maybe 2 or 3 thin stems, the boldest, most loving thing you can do is cut it back hard, down to about 12 inches from the ground, just above a strong pair of buds. The Illinois Extension recommends exactly this for a newly planted clematis, and so does every great grower I've ever read. It feels like vandalism. You're cutting off growth you waited months for, but an unpruned young clematis becomes one long, bare, lonely stem with a few flowers way up at the top, out of reach and out of sight. That one hard cut in the first spring forces the plant to branch from the base, to come back as 5 or 6 strong stems instead of 1. And that is the difference between a thin, leggy vine and a full flowering curtain 3 years on. Be brave once, early. The plant will reward you for the rest of its life. I want to end where we began, with those 30 seconds and a trowel. The first clematis I ever planted, I killed, not fast, and not with any wilt or disease. I killed it slowly and stupidly by doing very nearly everything this video just warned you about. I tucked it up hard against a west-facing brick wall because I loved the idea of purple flowers on that wall. Dry as a bone, right in the rain shadow, I planted it shallow, the way I planted everything, and when it sulked, I fussed over the leaves and fed the plant, instead of ever once tending the ground beneath it. 2 summers of that, and one September I dug it up in a temper and told myself clematis simply weren't for me. It took me years, and a patient old man at a county extension office who never once made me feel foolish for asking, to understand that I never had a clematis problem. I had a soil problem, and a setup problem, and a patience problem. The plant was never the thing that needed fixing. I was. When I finally planted one right, out in the living soil, roots deep and cool, leaning toward its support, then left alone to sleep and creep and leap, it did in 3 quiet years what I'd been begging it to do in 3 frantic weeks. And every June now, it climbs. And I think about how close I came to deciding I just wasn't the kind of person who could grow it. So if you've lost one before, hear me. You are not a bad gardener. You were simply never told about the 30 seconds. The soil remembers everything you give it, the compost, the patience, the second chance. Feed the ground, set the roots right, and this plant will outlast your mistakes. It certainly outlasted mine. If this cleared a few things up, if you're looking out the window right now at a clematis and realizing exactly which of these 10 you've been doing, then you already belong here. This channel is for gardeners who'd rather understand the soil than buy another bag of something. If that's you, subscribe, and let's keep tending the old, honest way together. Don't forget to grab that 1-page guide from the code earlier. Print it, tape it up, put it to work. And tell me down in the comments, which of the 10 was yours? Be honest. I'll bet it's number 7. Nearly everyone plants too shallow. I know I did. Now go on out there and give that plant the 30 seconds it deserves.